But the reality is that not a lot of people are centering disabled people when they're making these big decisions on votes like what happened last summer. They're thinking about the other parts of the bill, and frankly, not thinking about the realities of that people like me are sharing. So many disabled people came out. We had a 60-hour vigil on the mall in DC last summer where we read stories for 60 hours. And sometimes stories aren't enough, but unfortunately the pain is going to come. And I do think then there can be a little bit of a reckoning that needs to happen in terms of what our tax dollars should be funding.
Welcome to the Nick Speaks podcast, where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud for the disabled community. Tune in every Tuesday, and don't forget to subscribe. And now your host, Nicolas Comstock.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this brand new episode of the Nick Speaks podcast, the podcast dedicated to the disabled community, where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud about the issues that matter to the disabled the most. I'm your host, Nick Comstock. You guys, I'm so glad you joined me today on this Tuesday morning, or whenever you're listening to this episode. I am so glad to be with you as always, and today I have another amazing guest. She's been in the caregiving field for 15 years. She has personal experience. She has a family member, and we're going to talk about him and so much more. She is also the Chief Strategy Officer for Caring Across Generations. I actually found today's guest on a great podcast called In Sickness. We'll link that for you in the show notes. Please help me welcome Nicole Jorwic to the podcast. Nicole, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks, Nick. So glad to be joining you today.
I'm so glad that you're here. Your podcast with In Sickness. Who are the hosts of that again? Do you remember?
Oh, it was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
No, it's in no offense to the wonderful hosts who I know are in Minnesota. But
Allison, I think the name is Allison and Jason, I think are the names. Yeah.
I think you're right. You're right.
Allison and Jason. So I'm sorry that we couldn't remember your name, but I just did off at. So Allison and Jason, hey, I'm always looking to be on a podcast. So hit me up. So I found you just a couple weeks ago because I am the host of this podcast and I'm always looking for guests. And I heard a good portion of your episode and I was like, she would honestly be a great guest. So I reached out to you as soon as possible. I don't know when you got my email. It was probably in some ungodly hour because I don't know when to shut my eyes and go to sleep. But I knew you would be a great guest.
Thank you. And I responded right away because I always love talking to fellow disability advocates and talking about the issues that I get to work on every day.
Yeah. So you are involved in policy, you've been on the Hill, and why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who Nicole is and what you do, and then we'll get into the podcast and the crux of things and ask questions and have a great time.
That sounds great. So I have really been an advocate since before I knew that the word existed. I've been really lucky. I like to say that disability has been part of the fabric of my life from the very beginning because I was in the first included classroom in my school district a long, long time ago. I won't say how long, but many, many decades ago.
Sure.
And I also have my brother Chris, who has autism and will be 37 this year. And he is the heart behind a lot of what I do and a lot of how I move through the world and do the work that I do, and really leading with making sure that disabled voices are always front and center, and that I can be a good backup. I've been a direct care worker. I've been an attorney where I supported families who are going through disputes with school districts around special education. And I've been in the policy space for almost 15 years at this point at the state and national level in supporting services for people with disabilities, from home and community-based care to employment. And so that's a little bit of a mini bio. And yeah, glad to talk about any of it. It's all interesting and it's all hard in different ways, but it's also the most fulfilling work and that I'm lucky to do every day.
Yeah. So you're based in Illinois and I'm based in Ohio. And before that, 25 years of my life was I'm 36. Um 25 years of my life was spent in Northwest Indiana, which I'm sure you know where that's at.
Mhm.
And I was always told growing up that Illinois had some of the best benefits as far as disability services. But you shared with me in the pre-call that Illinois does not have some of the greatest benefits in disability services. So I don't know where I got my information from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in comparison to Indiana at different points, that certainly could have been true, but Illinois also has a historic over reliance on institutional based care, even in the year 2026. Sorry, my dogs are doing a lot right now. They
No, you're good.
they have seven institutions, state-run institutions that are still open. I think a lot of people assume that those all closed in like the 80s and 90s when there was those exposés, but there's still 35 states that have them open. And what that also means is that's a big suck of the resources and money that could be going to support home and community-based services. So in Illinois, there's a 15,000 person waiting list for these types of services. So actually, when it comes to all rankings, Illinois actually ranks towards the bottom when it comes to serving people with disabilities.
Wow, that's crazy. Um, Now I guess it could also depend on the city. I was also told that Chicago had some of the best services. I was told that Columbus, Ohio has some of the best services, which is true, because I'm reaping the benefits of that. I don't know about Chicago, considering the fact that it's in um, Illinois, obviously, but I was also told that bigger cities have better benefits. Um, so what do you think about the services as in Chicago specifically?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to name that there's really good providers in all parts of Illinois and all parts of the country. And certainly, I think when you're dealing with larger cities and larger regions, it means you're going to have larger pools when it comes to workforce. And so I do think when you have a stronger workforce, you're going to have stronger programs. So I do think that that's probably true. I'm not an expert in like ranking the different types of access, but I would say just from what I do know, that when you're in a concentrated area, you are going to have more options and also more workers, which is going to be helpful for finding the right supports.
Sure. So can you tell me, could you said you grew up with your brother, Chris, who's 37. So can you tell me how he kind of shaped your career choice for what
Sure.
now?
Yeah, I mean, I have always been somebody who's very focused on justice, and so Chris has some vocalizations and some stims that, like, when we're out in public, that became very obvious. Especially when we were younger, and I was the first one to kind of jump in and do what I would call educating, in as kind of a way as I could, when people were staring or making comments and that sort of thing. And it just made me realize how, everybody should have be able to be part of the community no matter how they show up in the community. And Chris doesn't use his voice to speak, but actually let's see, let me do some fast math. It was probably about 15, 16 years ago. Well, really, no, it was 20 years ago because it was in 2006. He started typing to communicate and using kind of simple yes, no, and multiple choice options. And it was then that we really realized how much he had been learning when he was in school. He was one of the first students with autism included in our school district. And he, all of a sudden through multiple choice got like a 98% on his constitution test. And all of a sudden his personality really started showing up in his typing in ways that were really amazing. And so just having him, all of us always believed and knew that he was there, and that's why we should be integrating him as much as possible. But for him to be able to express that back was really powerful. And around that time, I was already practicing special education law at that time, but it just really made me realize how important the voices, however those show up for people with disabilities, really leading in shifting the way that we think about people with disabilities was really important. And so, I mean, he's the voice in my head is, I guess, probably the best way to describe it, which is maybe ironic considering he doesn't use his voice to speak. But
Right.
knowing that the life that he wants and the life that he has is something that I think every disabled person should have access to is really what drives me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you seem to be fabulous at it. Um, so I have a question for you. You said, first of all, something that shocked me was you said 2006 was 20 years ago. My God, I'm old. Um, I don't know how old you feel, but I feel old hearing that 2006, 20 years ago. Um, so back in 2006, were IEPs a thing back then? Or was the country just dipping their feet in that?
Individualized education plans or IEPs were definitely a thing in 2006. How well they were being implemented is certainly another conversation. But ever since the base law that ultimately became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, came into law in like the 70s, mid 70s, there has been some form of individualized plan. However, there have been different legal cases that have meant that that individual plan has had to get better. As I mentioned, I was in the first included classroom in my school district. Chris was the first student with autism included in his school district. He's 5 years younger than me. And I guess I just gave away my age. But he
That's okay.
no, I know.
I'm
I'm just teasing. I'm not worried at all about it. But those were based on the fact that you had to include students is based on Supreme Court law and legal cases that required students to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And so while IEPs have existed for a really long time, the integration mandates and the how individualized they actually are have only gotten better since 2006.
That's awesome. Now, you said that you practiced special education law. So I'm assuming, and this is why I'm going to ask this question, did you practice law for private schools as well as public? Or did you just
I didn't represent the school districts. What I represented was the families. And so a lot of those families, the majority of those families, were working with public school districts. I did a lot of cases in Chicago public schools. Were focused on getting access to stronger public education. But there were some instances where the school districts were not doing what they were supposed to, and the student had so much lost opportunity that some of those parents, some of the families that we represented, were seeking placement in private schools to make up that lost time. But I worked with the majority were public education.
okay? The reason why I was asking that, Nicole, is because I grew up in a private Christian school, and back in 2001, which is 26 years ago or something like that, 27, somewhere around there, um, my church started a special ed classroom that was part of our already private Christian school. And I got a certificate of completion. I did not get a high school diploma. So that's why I was asking, did you ever do any um representing in private schools? Because I was trying to get a feel of the difference between private school special education and public school special.
Sure. I mean, and the biggest difference is that private schools don't have the same requirements to comply with the Individuals with
Right.
Disabilities Education Act, because that's only the school district, the public school district where a student lives, because federal government and state governments can't have as much of a say in what's happening in private schools. But what you're bringing up, the point of a certificate of completion versus a degree, is something that unfortunately a lot of people with disabilities have faced, whether it was in private school or public school. And
Mhm.
I kind of call that tracking, where they make assumptions. I'm a big believer in presuming competence. Chris, my brother, is the one who taught me that. When you assume that the person, no matter what their behaviors look like, I believe that every behavior is a form of communication or something else. You presume that they have competence. You presume that they have value, which of course we all should make those presumptions. But a lot of people see somebody's disability and that's all they see. And then you might end up in like a social skills track or and not be focus as much on academics. And that's really a disservice to the students with disabilities, no matter where they're being schooled.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, basically my certificate of completion was, I went to the classes, I ate all the food in the cafeteria and didn't really do much. Although I did do some oral presentations as opposed to written presentations because of my vision and my physical disability. I couldn't write and do that. But it's really made it difficult for me because I didn't get a high school diploma, which I didn't find out actually until a couple years after I graduated. And then I found out several years later that my parents actually knew that I wasn't going to get a high school diploma, which was really damaging because I was like, why would you pay for that?
Yeah, sure.
You know? So, and it's been really damaging for me because, and then they're like,
Employment prospects and stuff.
Yeah. And they're like, well, you don't have a high school diploma. And I was like, what? And so then they're like, you have to go to get a GED. And they're like, well, I don't know how well you're going to do with that because of reading comprehension and all that type of stuff. Cause I struggle with reading. And so, I'm just living by the seat of my pants and kind of carving my own path at this point, which is what everybody has told me that I have to do. So I'm glad to hear. I'm not glad to hear of the problem, I guess. I'm just glad to hear that I'm not the only one.
No, unfortunately, you're not the only one. And I do think it's gotten better, but it's definitely something that all people with disabilities should be mindful of. Because obviously disability employment is so important. And yeah, certainly education can impact employment prospects.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about, you said you've been a care worker not only for your brother, of course, but in the field. So I want to talk about some of your experiences there. Like what made you want, I know your brother's a big deal for you and why you do a lot of things that you do, but what made you specifically want to go into the home and care for other people? Uh,
Yeah. Well, I didn't do a ton of home care. I did a lot of classroom-based support and also like day camps support.
okay.
So I just kind of knew because of my experiences with my brother that like I had this ability to do personal care and to do other things. And so I've done everything from working in a classroom. I have done some home care, but it just wasn't the bulk of what I was doing. And but I just knew that if I was going to spend my time working, that I wanted to be working doing something that supported other people to live their best lives. And so even when I was in college, I I still worked, and I worked with a little kid who I can like see in my head, Roz, who I worked with him in multiple different settings, from a typical preschool, and then also in his home. Um, and and it was really obviously fulfilling to me, and I had to work, so I wanted the work to be meaningful. And that's kind of what's always guided me, including when I went to law school. I didn't know the kind of law that I wanted to practice, but I knew whatever I did, I wanted it to be helping people with disabilities. So that's always kind of been the driving force.
That's awesome. I love that. One of the things that I loved hearing you say on the podcast in sickness was that we need to get both political parties together because a lot of the, I'm going to try not to get in too much politics, but it's kind of hard because disability surrounds politics. And so, a lot of people in the disability community that I'm familiar with blame one particular party for hating people with disabilities or what have you. And they say one party is more for disabilities than the other party. And what I liked you saying is that we needed both Democrats and Republicans to come together and work on different things for people with disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about your policy work and some of the work that you've done on the Hill and some of the things you've tried to get passed and some of the things you may be working on now?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, and historically, actually, disability policy has been pretty bipartisan. I mean, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed by President George Bush,
Yeah.
H.W. Bush, and it was supported by members of both parties. And when you think of, there's other programs. So the work that I do really focuses a lot on Medicaid. I also have done employment policy in the past. Now I pretty much exclusively do Medicaid and Medicare work. But the reality is that even some as recently as 5 years ago, there have been bills that were supported by both Republicans and Democrats to expand access to home and community-based services through the Money Follows the Person program. So there are those snippets where you see that bipartisan work still happening, even in the divisive environment that we have. The problem is, though, and why I do think it looks partisan, even though it maybe isn't, is that when you have big threats against programs. So in 2017, there was a massive threat for cuts to the Medicaid program through like fundamental structural changes.
Sure.
And we were able to fight that off. I was right at the center of that fight when I was at the Arc of the United States. And also recently in the Medicaid cuts that were passed last summer, that there was only one party that was voting for those cuts. And those people were saying that they didn't want to do things that impacted people with disabilities, even though we were saying that the vote that you're taking is going to impact people with disabilities. And what we're seeing since the bill passed is that it's impacting people with disabilities. The reality is, though, is that it's about where we want our money to go. And that shouldn't be a political issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue to say, and it's actually not. We do polling all the time, and it shows that across the political spectrum, whether you're somebody who voted for the current president or you're somebody who voted for his opponent, over 90% of people believe that more tax money should be spent on supporting people with disability as an older adult.
Absolutely. Yes.
So the public support is there. The political will needs to get there. And I think that we'll have those moments again soon, hopefully. But the reality is that not a lot of people are centering disabled people when they're making these big decisions on votes like what happened last summer. They're thinking about the other parts of the bill, and frankly, not thinking about the realities of that people like me are sharing. So many people share their stories. So many disabled people came out. We had a 60-hour vigil on the mall in DC last summer where we read stories for 60 hours. And sometimes stories aren't enough, but unfortunately the pain is going to come. And I do think then there can be a little bit of a reckoning that needs to happen in terms of what our tax dollars should be funding. And the difficulty with it being bipartisan is that the cost to addressing waiting lists in this country for services, making sure that workers make more money, is ultimately has a dollar sign attached to it. But I think we're going to get there. I think the political will match the public opinion sooner than we think.
Yeah. I like your optimism, and I like that it's not just, oh my God, they're taking all the services away. Ugh. So my program is also about education, and I've never really had anybody about policy on. And maybe, if this is on the spot for you, we can come back and do another episode. But can you tell me what policy was passed
Yeah.
that you say is now affecting people with disabilities? Because I feel it's important for our viewers and listeners to know that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not putting me on the spot. I could probably talk about a lot of this stuff in my sleep. But so Medicaid, I think it's important to really have a little like quick, like 1 minute Medicaid 101.
Sure.
Medicaid is a state and federal partnership. It is a program that is overseen by a federal law, but that states run. States put the money in. They know that they're going to get a match back from the federal government because it's a partnership really when it comes to money. When big cuts were passed, and unfortunately last year in President Trump's One Beautiful Bill Act, it included over 900 billion with a B cuts to Medicaid over 10 years. And what that means is that that states are going to get less money. Medicaid makes up about 1/3 of state budgets across this country. So
Okay.
that's already having an impact because right now we're at a time when states are having their state sessions, their state legislative and governing sessions. And so we're seeing states already, the state of Idaho cut $22 million from the disability service system. Other states are cutting provider rates, which ultimately means cutting wages for workers to make up for that federal cut. The reason that this is happening,
Dollars
yeah,
for the
900,
$900 billion of cuts.
exactly,
Go on. Yeah.
930 to be exact. Um,
930. Yeah.
And the reason that this has an outsized impact on home and community-based services. So Medicaid is the only funder for home and community-based services. That's everything from a job coach to a group home to a personal care assistant. Those are all home and community-based services.
Right. Sure.
Home and community-based services are what people want. 95% of disabled people want to be aging and living in their homes and in their communities. That's not where the funding is. And the reason that the cuts have a greater outsized impact on community-based services is I mentioned that the federal law is what oversees the program. That federal law makes home and community-based services. President Reagan did this in 1981. He created the option for home and community-based services because at the time, facility-based care was the only option for funding, but those services were made optional and not mandatory. Whereas institutional services, hospitalizations, those things are mandatory under the federal law. And so when states face these large cuts, $930 billion, they don't really have a choice on where they can look to cut because they have to keep funding the mandatory services. So home and community-based services, which is what we were saying all last year, were going to be have an outsized impact on them. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing play out. The bill makes these cuts with eligibility redeterminations every 6 months. My brother had autism 6 months ago. He's going to have autism 6 months from now. But now there's this paperwork gap and paperwork burden that family caregivers and people with disabilities are going to have to handle. It's already come up. My mom called me almost in tears because she didn't want to mess something up to mess up Chris's services. And it's also coming through work requirements, which work requirements, first of all, the vast majority of people who receive Medicaid are already working. And it's also another system that states have to set up that's going to cost money to set it up. And we know that at least 7 million people will lose services because of getting lost in the paperwork trap. And so the cuts are huge because they're already having an impact. And also the way they made the cuts are going to have even harder and tougher implications. And there's no plan at this point to delay any of this implementation. So it's all going to be coming down January 1st of next year.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I did see a little bit of this in the news throughout last year. I try not to watch a lot of news because I feel like a lot of them, no matter what side you're on, both of them try to scare the shit out of you. no matter what happens. I feel like both sides are in the game of fear and let's do whatever to get whoever to vote for us, and we don't care. And that's on both sides of the aisle, I feel. But one of the things that the Medicaid director was saying, and a lot of people that were pushing these cuts, is that a lot of this $930 billion was fraud. How much of that do you think is actual fraud versus cutting people who actually need the services?
Yeah. So I do want to be like clear that the fraud conversation actually started well after they voted for the cuts. The fraud conversation really started last December, which was 5 months after they already passed the cuts.
Okay.
This is a newer narrative that they're bringing up and something that I want to be really clear on. There are
Sure.
there are already oversight mechanisms in the program that does catch bad actors. But those bad actors are providers. Those bad actors aren't disabled people or family caregivers or individuals at all. So those oversight mechanisms, really important, should exist. They're going to get weakened with these cuts. So I don't Sure, there's a very small percentage of fraud, but it's actually gotten better in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's like less than 3%, I believe. So this new conversation about fraud, actually, when they're talking about it, and it just happened in Congress this past week, where HHS Secretary Kennedy was talking about the fact that paying family caregivers is fraud. That's not true. They're talking about personal care. And in the state of New York, they sent a letter saying that 95% of Medicaid beneficiaries were getting personal care. They had to publicly apologize because that was incorrect. So
Wow.
I am a big believer in just facts and the truth. And the
Yeah.
reality is this fraud narrative is really actually trying to provide cover for the cuts that are happening.
Mm.
And that's what's really frustrating to me because, again, those mechanisms already exist and they should. And they recover money that should be for the system. But
Sure.
some of those bad actors and some of them are serving in Congress right now.
Yeah. Oh, sure. And I believe that fraudsters are on both sides. So I'm not disagreeing with you about that at all. I'm not disagreeing with anything you said. And I encourage anybody, whether it's the federal Medicaid director, Dr. Emmett Oz, or Secretary Kennedy, to come on my show and talk about these
Yeah. And
cuts.
and just to be clear, I had a meeting with Dr. Oz about a month ago where I pushed back on this whole narrative. I believe that if we don't talk to each other, we're not going to find solutions. And I
Right.
think that those solutions obviously have to be rooted in what's actually happening.
So what was that conversation with him like, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be a little cautious because I want to be invited back into meetings, obviously. But it was the root of the conversation was about fraud, waste, and abuse. And what I was able to share were the mechanisms that were already in place. And I was able to share where there might be some fraud in the system, like private equity, who's buying up a lot of home care providers and in cutting, so again, like reasonable minds can differ on certain things and still find common ground. And so that is what I focused on is the types of services that you're talking about on their face as fraudulent are not. I provided facts and data about why they are not. And then I talked about some other places that would make more sense to me as an advocate to look for money in the system.
Well, you said you wanted to be cautious and you wanted to be invited back in meetings. And I totally respect that because I get that too. But I will say that my mantra is speak up, speak out, and speak loud. And if you were to ever get ousted from that, I would come out publicly on this program and say, this is what I do. This is what I'm talking about. So get your shit together. And I would say that for both parties. I just want to put that out there for me personally. And again, I invite any of these people that have real power to change the lives of people with disabilities, good, bad, or indifferent, to come on my program. This is why this program exists. This is why we're over 80 episodes in. And this is why I wanted to have you on. So at the end of that meeting, did you feel at all like did you feel at all that you guys got to at least some common ground?
I think that what we got, which is I think frankly sometimes the best you can get in meetings, is seeing the humanity of one another and understanding that intentions aren't bad, even though viewpoints can be different. And I agreed to continue to talk to them and figure out ways to work together in ways that make sense. And that's my goal with any meeting that I have on both because I work really hard on the Hill and with administrations, no matter who's the president, to have strong relationships with the administration and with both sides of the aisle. And I think that's really important.
Because you have to, because otherwise nothing is going to get done on either side. You have to. I don't like how either party, when they're in power, tries to bulldoze each other and say we're going to do this no matter who. And it just serves nobody. And that's why I like what you said on the podcast that I found you is we both have to come together and talk about these things. I want to talk about, you said earlier in the podcast that 35 states still have institutions that are running. And in the pre-call, you gave me a general number of $200,000 that is spent on these institutions per year. Now, does that $200,000, Nicole, does that come from Medicaid programs?
Yes. And it's more like between 215 and 250,000 per year per person, per institution. And part of that is because what you're paying for is keeping these buildings open and obviously the staff and everything else. Whereas the average cost for serving somebody in their home and community ranges between 50 to 75,000. So it's much more fiscally responsible to serve people in the community. But the reality is that yes, they do. It comes from Medicaid, and again, institutions are part of that mandatory spending. So it's more expensive to serve 2,000 in Illinois. It's more expensive to serve 2,000 people in 7 institutions than this state's entire budget for the people that they support in the home and community. There's been a lot of efforts to what we call rebalance the system. And there's been a lot of progress where more people are being served in their homes and communities than institutions. But that rebalancing doesn't match the desire. And, 95% of people want to live in their homes and communities. 95% of Medicaid long-term care dollars are not going to homes and communities. So that's what we really, I think, need to solve for when we have an opportunity to solve the problem.
So 95% of Medicaid dollars, you're saying that in your opinion should be going to home community-based services are not.
Correct. It's more like the national average is just a little over 50%.
Wow.
And that's across the board. So for disabled people, it's 95% of people want to stay in their homes and communities. For older adults, it's 90%. But you have whole industries that are based, the nursing home industry, other industries, and there always will be a need for some level of that. Again, you notified notified or nursing facilities, whatever, for different agencies. But I didn't say 100, but it's very far, the 50+% to 95%. There's a big gap of funding that needs to come to serve the people that are currently on waiting lists. And that's over 500,000 people.
Sure, absolutely. And so do you think that if maybe not all 35 states shut all the institutions down, because like you said, there is still a place for that, like nursing homes and ICFs and other things. Do you think that if these 35 states did a significant downsize of these institutions, we could take the 215 to 250,000, put that back into Medicaid. Do you think that would relieve some of the financial strain off of
Yeah.
the community-based services?
I do think that would help. I do want to just, I don't believe, I think that yes, could be a need for private nursing facilities, ICFs, which are also private. I don't believe that any state needs to have a state-run institution. I think that those are antiquated models that should go away. So I do think that you can still have facility-based care, but it shouldn't be state-operated. And a lot of people don't think that these places are still open because they call them different things. It's in Illinois, it's state operated developmental center. Well, that doesn't sound that bad. In some places, it's state schools. In some places, it's state hospitals. You can still have the services that are delivered in those places, but they shouldn't be run by the state because that's inadvertently looking like that's the service delivery system that states think is best.
And in a way, I was on the HRC committee here in Richland County, Ohio for 4 years. In a way, that's taking away a lot, if not all, of some human rights of the people who live there. Is it not? Because they have to go by what the state tells them.
Yeah,
And
100%. And a lot of them also, I mean, several of them in Illinois have been under review for getting their certification pulled because of some of the horrible things that happen in them still. And again, this is the year 2026. In Iowa, there were horrible abuses that were just in the last few years exposed. Like these are places that just shouldn't exist. And to your point, to the point of your question, they're places that are sucking up a lot of resources that could actually be used to support people in the community and also to raise wages for direct care workers in the community.
sure, sure. I'm a little ignorant, Nicole. This is one of the reasons why I do this show. Can you tell me the difference between a state institution versus a nursing home and an ICF?
Sure, nursing homes and ICFs are run by local providers. Some of them are run by corporations, and that varying viewpoints on that. But a lot of them, I see a lot of ICFs are run by nonprofit providers, whereas state operated developmental centers literally have a state funded staff person running them. So they're run by, instead of a nonprofit, they're run by the state.
And why are you so passionate? And I agree, because I know a lot of people in my state alone are worried that the current administration is going to go back to an institutionalized model. And I don't believe that they are. But why are you so passionate? What is it that you've seen in these state institutions that say these need to go?
It's because of the fact that that's where a lot of money is being spent, that it shouldn't. And the reason that people have concerns that whether it's an intended consequence or not, but that a consequence of the cuts could lead to heavier levels of
Sure.
unnecessary institutionalization, is because there won't be a home and community-based service to back up.
Mm.
Because when you have cuts, the first, like I said, because HCBS, home and community-based services, are optional services, those are going to be cut. And so then because I think here's a way to describe it that I think a lot of people don't realize. In my home state of Illinois, there's 15,000 people on the waiting list, as I said. Some of those people are going to wait up to a decade for services. Any of those people at any point has a right to institutional care. What they're waiving is that right to institutional care. So any of those people could go to one of those 7 places. They're not going. They'd rather wait for 10 years because that's not what they want.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
that might be, and so what I'm passionate about is giving people with disabilities what they want, which is home and community-based services. And why I'm really also passionate about the closure of large state-run institutions is because of the historic harms and the continued current harms to disabled people who are living there.
Absolutely. So that's interesting that you say there's a list of 15,000 people that are still waiting on home community-based services. Here in Ohio, I don't know how long ago it's been. I think it may have been 11 years ago or so. We did something called Fix the List. And now I don't think we have any waiting list. If we do, it's a small waiting list for people to receive um, home and community-based services. And anyone in the state of Ohio can email me or correct me on this information. Um, did you look into Ohio's Fix the List initiative, and did anyone try to get an initiative like that started in Illinois?
Certainly. So there is still a waiting list in Ohio. I just did a quick search. It's not as big as Illinois, but there is still a waiting list. And what I will say about things like Fix the List, they're great as long as they're associated with funding. Frankly, a lot, and I'm not familiar with Ohio, so I'm not making a commentary on Ohio's because I'd have to do research. But a lot of them actually are fixing the list sometimes just means pulling people off of the list, but that doesn't mean serving them. And so I do think that what we actually need is a federal requirement and a federal change. So I mentioned that, and I can talk about this because it will have been introduced by the time this airs, but um, that home and community-based services are optional under the federal law. That's what we really need to change. We need to put it on equal footing to institutional-based care and also make it mandatory under the law. So there is a bill that I've been working on for almost 10 years that's going to be reintroduced next in late April. So it has already been introduced. Folks can Google it as they're listening. But the HCBS Access Act would do exactly what I'm talking about, which is make home and community-based services mandatory under the federal law. And that would mean that states would have to provide those services just like they have to provide other types of services. Fundamentally, what that would mean is that waiting lists would have to go away. The bill also includes a lot of funding to make sure that that happens, because right now there's 600,000 people, over 600,000 people waiting for services. You can't just put 600,000 more people in the current system that already has workforce shortages and already doesn't have enough providers. And so what the bill does is also provides a bunch of funding to create that infrastructure needed to pull those people off of the waiting list. And so that's, I think, what you need to see, because the state by state way hasn't historically worked, or else we wouldn't still have 35 states that have institutions, and we wouldn't still have all but a handful of states that have waiting lists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you say you don't know much about Ohio and you would have to do some research. I can tell you that Ohio, North Carolina, and Missouri, and those are three states that are still run by county boards. And so we have 88 counties here, which means we have 88 county boards. And so what that means is that there's a 40 and 60% match. I believe the federal level pays 60%, or the state pays 60%, and the county board pays 40%. And the services here are really phenomenal. We were actually told by my case manager here we were told by my case manager in Indiana, that Ohio has really great services. It's one of the things that we're facing here in Ohio is that everybody's kind of afraid of property tax going away, because a lot of our services are solely based on property tax levies.
So that covers the county-based side?
Yes.
That makes sense, yeah.
So, and it's not just going to affect if this property tax thing gets on the ballot or in November, or if it doesn't get on the ballot in November, but it gets on the ballot eventually. It's still going to affect schools, police, fire departments, anything that does with community-based services, whether it's disability or not. It's going to strongly affect it. So, and it's not that I don't want anybody to, because I was just talking with someone that will be on my podcast this Tuesday. For those of you who don't know, we pre-record this episode. I talk like it's Tuesday all the time, but we pre-record most of our episodes. And so one of the things that she shared with me is that a lot of people are afraid of, once this gets on the ballot, we're just going to lose our services and they're all going to go away. No, it's just going to go into the state budget directly, and we're going to have to figure it out like the rest of the states do who don't have county boards. Okay, this is what we're going to have to set aside for fire. This is what we're going to have to set aside for police, all those type of things. But it really is going to affect our system if this does get on the ballot. But what I want to encourage service providers and county boards to do is stop being so afraid of it, where stop being so focused on the fear, where you're not providing the good quality services that you still can while these property taxes are still in place. And we need to figure out, if that does happen, where do we go from here? I feel like everybody's in a state of fear right now because of this. But anyway, I'm sorry I got on a tangent.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, I think that ultimately what you're talking about, whether it's tax revenue, property tax revenue, or federal taxes, ultimately it's about what do we want, what do we want our public dollars to be supporting, whatever the funding source, whether that's property taxes, what have you. And like I said, there is almost universal, like frankly nothing polls better than the way that we see polling across the political spectrum on public dollars going to support people with disabilities and aging adults in the community. And so I think that's what we have to focus on while everybody kind of works out the different mechanisms. Because to your point, yeah, Ohio has county boards. That's different than a lot of places. And regardless, even when we get to making home and community-based services mandatory at the federal level and the funding that goes with that, there's always going to need to be local and state money that's going to go into it. It is this partnership. And so I think it's ultimately about asking people those questions versus getting involved in like the nitty-gritty of tax fights. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And and I'm going to have you second this. This is why I preach so much that people need to get involved with their local state politics. I just testified in front of part of the Ohio legislature on March 17th, specifically about disability housing and the Capital Community Assistance Fund. I may have just butchered that, but I testified in front of them on March 17th. And so, services for people with disabilities are never going to improve unless people do what I say week in and week out, which is speak up, speak out, and speak loud about the issues that matter to the disabled community the most. That's the best thing. People say, how can I get involved? Get involved with, I'm sure every state has local advocacy chapters. We have several advocacy chapters here in Ohio. I'm sure you do in Illinois. Get involved. Start somewhere. We can't just say, oh, well, the state doesn't care about me. They're not going to listen to what I say. Well, then if you constantly have that attitude, nothing is going to change. Nothing is.
No, 100%. I completely agree. And that's a good point to really end on, is that it's so incredibly important, whether it's your local politicians, state politicians, or federal legislators, that you're the face or the voice that they're thinking about when they're making some of these decisions. And that's only going to happen if you're out there talking, sharing your story, advocating, because that's really how we make change, is by coming together and by being involved. We can't just sit on the sidelines. What we have to push so that political will can match the public opinion.
Absolutely. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Nicole, are there any, final words that you would like to say to our audience and our listeners? Maybe an encouragement or something for
Yeah.
people that are coming into this field, or even people that have been here for 30 years. Maybe they need some encouragement to keep going.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is hope. I think that even in the face of a lot of cuts, the realities and like the groundswell is coming in a way that's helpful. And something that I say a lot that I think I'll end on here is that you don't have to, I talked a lot about kind of Medicaid policy and other things that can be confusing and can be hard. You don't have to be an expert. All you have to be an expert on is your own story and the needs that you have and the needs that those in your community have that aren't being met. You don't have to know the ins and outs of this policy to be a strong advocate. All you have to do is be able to share why this matters to you and why this matters to your family.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for being here. This was fun. And we'll definitely have another conversation. If something with big policy comes back and you want to come share it, please do, because this is why this program is here. I want you to stay with me real quick because we'll have a 1 to 2 minute conversation after I'm done recording. I know you probably got to go to another meeting. But this is the Nick Speaks podcast, where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud about the issues that matter to the disabled the most. And I want to say thank you to my guest, Nicole, for being here. And I want to say thank you for listening and watching today's podcast. I will see you next week for an all-new episode. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Nick Speaks podcast, where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud for the disabled community. If today's conversation resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a new episode. You can find Nick across all platforms by visiting his link tree in the show notes. And please leave a comment to join the conversation. Until next time, keep speaking up, keep speaking out, and keep speaking loud.